He is not afraid of losing you. He is afraid of how easily you would let him go. If you remember nothing else from the next 20 minutes, remember that one sentence, because it is the key that unlocks almost everything confusing about why an avoidant man cannot stop thinking about an older woman. Not a woman who begs, not a woman who waits by the phone, rehearsing what she will say when he finally texts back. A woman who simply keeps living her life, whether he is in it or not. And there is one specific behavior underneath that truth, one single, repeatable, learnable thing she does that creates this effect more reliably than anything else. Today, I want to isolate that behavior completely, show you exactly what it looks like in practice, and show you how it can be built at any age. Because this was never really about being older. It was always about being someone who stopped performing for a man's attention a long time ago. If you are here because someone pulled away and you cannot understand why he seems more haunted by you now than he ever was interested in you while things were good, stay with me, because by the end of this, you are going to understand something most women spend years trying to figure out through trial and error and heartbreak. Let's start with what an avoidant man's nervous system actually expects from closeness, because you cannot understand what disrupts the pattern until you understand the pattern itself. An avoidant man spends most of his adult romantic life running a very specific, very predictable script. Someone gets close, he feels the walls closing in, even if nothing threatening has actually happened. He creates distance. Sometimes that looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like a slow fade, fewer texts, shorter replies, plans that keep getting pushed back. Sometimes it looks like disappearing outright. And the woman on the other end of that distance usually responds in one of two ways. Either she panics and chases, which confirms his deepest fear that closeness always comes with a leash attached to it. Or she gets hurt and pulls away too, which confirms his other deepest fear, that closeness always ends eventually anyway. So why bother fully investing in the first place? Either way, notice what happens. His nervous system gets exactly what it expected. Predictable, manageable, survivable, painful, maybe, but familiar. And familiar, to a nervous system built around self-protection, always feels safer than unknown, even when unknown would actually be better for him. Now picture what happens when an older, more emotionally secure woman enters that same pattern. She does not chase. And this is important, so let me be precise about it, because it is easy to misunderstand. She does not chase, not because she is performing indifference, not because she read somewhere that playing it cool works on men like this, and not because she is punishing him for pulling away. She does not chase because she genuinely does not have the bandwidth for games anymore. She built a life. Somewhere along the way, she developed a career she actually cares about, or a rhythm to her days that she protects, friendships she has kept alive through years of effort, maybe children, maybe a business, maybe simply a full, textured, occupied existence that took her a long time to construct, and that she is not willing to abandon just because a man got quiet. So when he pulls away, her world does not collapse. It just keeps turning. She goes to dinner with her friends. She finishes the project she was working on. She goes to bed at a decent hour and actually sleeps. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a question starts forming that he cannot fully answer and honestly does not want to sit with. If she does not need me here, why do I feel like I need to be there? That question, uncomfortable and quiet as it is the beginning of what looks from the outside like obsession. Here is the one behavior at the center of all of this, the thing everything else in this video circles back to. She responds instead of reacting. That is it. That is the whole engine underneath everything we are about to talk about. When he pulls away or goes quiet, she does not immediately fire off a string of texts asking what is wrong. She does not spiral into 3 different stories about what his silence probably means. She notices the distance. Sometimes she even names it, calmly, without accusation, without an edge in her voice. Something as simple as, "I noticed you have been distant lately. Is everything okay?" And then, this is the part almost nobody actually does. She waits for a real answer instead of filling the silence herself with anxious guesses dressed up as certainty. That single behavior, responding instead of reacting, is almost unheard of to a man who has spent his whole relational history bracing for chaos. And when he encounters it, it registers as something close to safety, which is deeply unfamiliar, and because it is unfamiliar, deeply intriguing to a nervous system that has been trained to expect escape routes at every turn. I want to slow down here because this is where most explanations of avoidant attachment go wrong. People treat avoidance like it is about avoiding people. It is not. It is about avoiding a very specific feeling, the feeling of being trapped, obligated, or overwhelmed by someone else's emotional needs. Most avoidant men develop this pattern early, often in childhood, where love came with strings attached, where affection had to be earned through performance, where closeness meant slowly losing themselves to keep someone else comfortable. So as adults, their nervous system quietly treats intimacy like danger, even in moments when part of them desperately wants exactly the closeness they are running from. Now think about the emotional weather most partners unintentionally bring into a relationship with someone like this. Anxiety, fear of abandonment, a need for constant reassurance, all of it completely understandable, often shaped by their own history and their own wounds. But to an avoidant nervous system, that particular energy reads as pressure. And pressure in his internal wiring equals danger. Danger triggers withdrawal. It is not a conscious calculation. It is closer to a reflex. An older, more grounded woman, more often than not, brings a completely different emotional climate into the relationship. Not because she does not feel anxious sometimes, everybody does, but because she has usually done real work. Whether that came through therapy, through failed relationships that taught her hard lessons, or simply through enough years of living to understand herself better. She has learned that her worth is not measured by whether a man decides to stay. She has learned that begging never made anyone love her more, only smaller. She has learned that her own peace is not optional anymore. It is required. And she is no longer willing to trade it for the temporary comfort of being chosen. So when he pulls back, she does not escalate. She observes. She does not spiral. She recalibrates. And that stillness, that specific quality of not reacting, is often the most disorienting thing he has ever experienced in a relationship. Here is a truth about avoidant men that they rarely admit even to themselves. They test people, not maliciously, not on purpose in a calculated way, but instinctively, almost automatically. They pull away to see what happens next. If you chase, part of him feels temporarily soothed because it confirms he is wanted. But another part feels suffocated because now there is pressure to reciprocate something he is not sure he can safely give. If you disappear too, part of him feels relieved because the thread of closeness has evaporated. But another part feels a fresh, sharp grief, a quiet confirmation that closeness always ends in loss, exactly like he expected. An older woman does neither of those things. She does not chase. She does not disappear in a dramatic exit designed to provoke a reaction out of him. She simply steps back to a comfortable distance and continues her life calmly, without spectacle, without narrating it to him or to anyone else. There is no performance in it. And because there is no performance, he cannot locate the manipulation he has spent his whole life training himself to detect. He searches for the angle. He searches for the game underneath her calm, and there is none. That absence of a game is, strangely, one of the most confusing and most magnetic things a man like this can encounter. Let's go one layer deeper, because there is a second part to this that most explanations skip entirely. Older women, generally speaking, have gone through enough relationships to lose their illusions about fixing men. A younger woman, especially one earlier in her relationship history, often believes that if she loves someone hard enough, patiently enough, sacrifices enough of herself, she can heal whatever wound is making him distant. It is a generous, deeply human instinct. It is also, almost always, a losing strategy because you cannot love someone into secure attachment. Healing is an inside job. No amount of patience from you can override someone else's nervous system for them. An older woman has usually learned this the hard way. Maybe she spent years trying to be enough for someone who was never emotionally available to begin with. Maybe she watched herself shrink, adjust, over-explain, and still lose the relationship anyway, despite doing everything she thought she was supposed to do. And somewhere inside that painful education, she absorbed a lesson that changes everything downstream of it. She stopped trying to earn love through effort. She started simply deciding whether someone was a match for the life she had already built, rather than auditioning for a role in someone else's uncertainty. That shift from trying to be chosen to simply choosing or not choosing is one of the most powerful forces an avoidant man will ever encounter, because his entire relational history has trained him to expect pursuit. He is used to being the prize that people work to keep. An older, self-possessed woman is not interested in prizes. She is interested in partnership, and if partnership is not on the table, she is not going to audition for the role of the exception to his pattern. She will simply continue on with or without him. Think about what that does to a man who has spent his whole adult life controlling the emotional temperature of every relationship he has been in. Suddenly, he is with someone who is not asking him to change the temperature at all. She has her own thermostat, and she is completely fine adjusting her life around his presence or his absence, because either way, her life still works. This is where the intensity really begins. An avoidant man will often describe an experience with a woman like this using words like unsettling or intense, even when nothing dramatic actually happened, because for the first time, he cannot locate the usual exits. There is no fight to provoke, so he can justify leaving. There is no clinginess to resent, so he can create distance. There is no crisis that requires him to either rescue her or retreat from her. There is just a calm, steady, self-sufficient presence, quietly living her own life, occasionally including him in it, never orbiting entirely around him. And because his brain cannot categorize her using any of his old patterns, it starts paying attention in a different way. Not the anxious, obsessive attention people usually picture, though that can happen too, but something slower and more persistent, a background awareness, a recurring thought, a comparison he cannot help but make every time someone new comes along and immediately starts performing for his approval. Because once a man has experienced a woman who does not perform, everyone who does perform starts to feel a little hollow by comparison. Let's talk about the specific, observable ways that one core behavior, responding instead of reacting, shows up in daily life. Because this is not abstract psychology, this is concrete and repeatable. First, she does not outsource her identity to the relationship. A lot of women, especially when they are younger, unconsciously let a relationship become the main event of their lives. Friendships, hobbies, ambitions, all of it slowly gets deprioritized in favor of managing the relationship and staying attuned to someone else's moods. An older, more grounded woman has usually already learned that this is a trap. She keeps her friendships alive. She keeps her interests alive. She keeps her own goals moving forward regardless of what is happening romantically. So when he creates distance, there is no vacuum for him to notice because her life was never structured entirely around him to begin with. Second, she communicates boundaries without punishment. This one is subtle but incredibly powerful. Less experienced communication often blends boundaries with emotional consequences, the silent treatment, withdrawn affection, escalating conflict to force change. A woman who has done real internal work tends to state boundaries plainly and then simply follow through, without drama, without needing him to feel bad about it. Something like, I am not available for last-minute plans anymore. I need consistency to feel secure in this. If that does not work for you, I understand, but it will not work for me either, said calmly, without anger underneath it. It lands completely differently than the same words delivered in the middle of a fight. Third, she is not afraid of the relationship ending. Not because she does not care, but because she has survived endings before and knows, from experience rather than theory, that she can survive another one if it comes to that. That lack of desperation quietly removes the leverage an avoidant man is used to having. He cannot dangle the threat of leaving over someone who has already made peace with the possibility. And a relationship without that particular leverage forces him to actually show up as a person, rather than as someone managing another person's fear of abandonment. Fourth, watch what happens in the small digital signals, the texting patterns nobody talks about but everybody feels. A woman who is anxiously attached will often mirror his pace exactly, or worse, escalate past it, sending a second message before the first one is even answered, adding explanations nobody asked for, softening every request until it barely resembles a request at all. A more grounded woman texts the way she lives, clear, warm, unhurried. She does not send 3 messages when one will do. She does not apologize for taking a day to reply if her day was genuinely full. She is not cold in her messages. She is simply not performing an urgency she does not actually feel. And a man who has spent years associating text notifications with obligation and pressure experiences her texts as something closer to relief. No demand hiding underneath the words, no test buried inside the punctuation. just a person communicating like a person, which sounds simple until you realize how rare it actually is in practice. Now, I want to be very clear about something, because this part matters enormously, and it is where a lot of well-meaning advice goes wrong. None of this means you should be doing something to manipulate an avoidant man into obsession. This is not a strategy. It is not a technique you can fake your way into successfully. If you try to perform calm detachment while secretly falling apart inside, it will not work, because avoidant men, ironically, tend to be extremely sensitive to inconsistency between what someone says and what they actually feel underneath it. What creates this effect is not the appearance of independence, it is the reality of it. The security has to be real. The life has to actually be full. The peace has to actually be earned, not staged for an audience of one. This is exactly why so many attempts to copy this dynamic backfire. A woman reads about attachment styles, decides to try being unbothered, stops texting back quickly, acts busy, plays it cool on the surface while internally checking her phone every 4 minutes and rehearsing what she will say if he finally reaches out. Avoidant men can often sense that gap between performance and reality, almost instinctively, because their whole life has trained them to detect inauthenticity as a survival skill. The response, instead of reacting, that actually creates this effect only works because it is not an act. It comes from years of genuinely building a life that does not depend on any one person's presence in it. So if you are listening to this thinking, okay, but I am not older yet, I have not had decades to build that kind of security, here is the part that should actually encourage you. Age is not the operative variable here. Age is just often correlated with the real variable, which is emotional development. There are women in their 20s who have done more internal work than some women in their 50s. There are women in their 60s still chasing validation like they are 19. What actually creates this effect is not a number on a birth certificate, it is a level of self-possession. And self-possession can be built at any age. It just usually takes deliberate effort rather than waiting passively for time to do it for you. Let's talk about how that gets built, because I do not want to leave you with a diagnosis and no direction. The first shift is learning to separate your sense of safety from someone else's behavior. This sounds abstract, but it is actually very practical. It means noticing when your nervous system starts spiraling because someone went quiet, and instead of immediately trying to fix the silence, asking yourself, what do I actually know right now versus what am I imagining? Most anxious spirals are built almost entirely out of imagined scenarios, not actual information. Learning to sit with not knowing without catastrophizing every gap in communication is one of the most powerful skills you can develop, and it is exactly the skill that emotionally secure women tend to have refined through repetition, often the hard way. The second shift is rebuilding a life that exists independently of your relationship status. Not as a strategy to make him chase you, but because you genuinely deserve a full life, regardless of what any one person decides to do. Reconnect with the friendships that have gone quiet. Pick back up the hobby you dropped when things got serious. Set goals that have nothing to do with your relationship at all. This is not about becoming unavailable to punish anyone. It is about becoming so genuinely occupied by your own life that his distance does not create a crater. It just creates a small, manageable gap that your life naturally fills back in on its own. The third shift, and this is the one people resist the most, is releasing the fantasy that you can love someone into becoming secure. You cannot. I know that is hard to hear, especially if you are deeply invested in someone right now. But healing an avoidant attachment style is work that has to happen inside the person who has it. You can be patient, you can be understanding, you can create a safe, consistent environment for someone, but the actual transformation has to come from him, through his own choice, his own reflection, his own willingness to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. Your job is not to fix him. Your job is to decide whether the relationship as it currently exists is one you actually want to stay in. Here is something worth sitting with, because it reframes everything we have covered so far. When an avoidant man becomes fixated on a woman like this, it is rarely because she did anything specifically engineered to affect him. It is because she reflected something back to him that he had never fully confronted. The fact that real intimacy does not require him to lose himself, and the fact that real safety does not have to be earned through control. That realization can be incredibly attractive, and it can also be incredibly threatening, sometimes at the exact same time. which is why some avoidant men, faced with exactly this kind of steadiness, do not move toward it at all. They retreat further and faster because the possibility of a healthy relationship can feel more dangerous to their identity than the familiar pain of an unhealthy one. This matters because it means the effect we have been describing is not automatically a happy ending. Sometimes it results in a man finally doing the internal work and showing up differently over time, if he chooses to. Sometimes it results in him running so far and so fast that the relationship simply ends, while he spends months or years quietly comparing every future partner to the one who never chased him. Either outcome is, in its own way, a form of respect, even if it does not feel like that in the moment, because in both cases, the woman in question was never diminished by his response. She did not need his obsession to validate her worth, and she does not need his healing to complete her own story. One of the more fascinating parts of this dynamic is how avoidant men often narrate the relationship to themselves afterward. In the moment, while it is happening, they might genuinely believe they are the ones in control, deciding how much closeness to allow, setting the pace entirely on their own terms. But months later, sometimes years later, something shifts. They start reframing the story. What once felt like control starts to feel like loss. What once felt like independence starts to feel like abandonment, except this time self-inflicted. This delayed processing is incredibly common with avoidant attachment because in the moment of closeness, the nervous system is too busy managing perceived threat to actually register what is happening emotionally in real time. It is only later, once the threat is gone, once the relationship has ended or faded, that the full weight of what he experienced finally lands. This is why you sometimes hear about avoidant men reaching out months after things ended, seemingly out of nowhere, with a level of clarity and regret that was completely absent while things were actually happening. It is not that new information came to light. It is that his nervous system finally had enough distance to process what it could not process up close. For a self-possessed woman, this delayed reckoning rarely destabilizes her because by the time it arrives, she is usually already moved forward. She is not sitting around waiting for closure. She built her own closure the moment she decided her peace mattered more than his timeline. I also want to address something that comes up constantly whenever this topic gets discussed, which is whether all of this is just a fancy way of describing playing hard to get. It is not, and the distinction matters enormously. Playing hard to get is a strategy performed for an audience of one, designed specifically to manipulate someone's interest. What we are describing here is the opposite. It is a woman who has built a full life for herself, for her own sake, completely independent of whether any particular man notices or responds to it. The effect on an avoidant man happens as a side consequence, not as the goal. And that distinction is exactly why it cannot be faked convincingly for very long. Genuine self-possession has a texture that performed detachment simply does not have. And people who have spent their whole lives scanning for authenticity as a defense mechanism tend to notice the difference eventually, whether they can articulate why or not. There is also a life stage element worth naming directly because it changes how this dynamic plays out with men who are further along in years and still avoidant. A man in his 40s, 50s, or 60s who has carried this pattern for decades has usually had far more time for it to calcify. More relationships that ended the same disappointing way. More evidence quietly stacking up that something in his approach is not working, even if he has never said that out loud to anyone, including himself. That accumulation matters. It means when he encounters a woman who is calm, established, and clearly not auditioning for his approval, the contrast lands harder because he is not comparing her to one ex. He is comparing her to a lifetime pattern of chasing, retreating, and being chased in return. And for what might be the first time, none of his old moves seem to apply to her at all. There is also something worth naming about status and comparison, because it plays a bigger role here than people usually admit. Avoidant men, like most people, are influenced by social proof, even if they would never say that out loud. Watching someone who is clearly desired by others, who has options, who is visibly not sitting around waiting, activates something fairly primal. It is not about competition in a shallow, ego-driven sense, though sometimes that is part of it. It is more about an unconscious recalibration of value happening underneath the surface. If other people are drawn to her and she is not desperate for his attention specifically, his brain starts assigning her a different category than the women who make themselves entirely available to him without being asked. This is not fair, and it is not something anyone should have to perform for. But understanding it helps explain part of why women with a fuller, more established life tend to trigger this response more consistently than women whose entire world has quietly narrowed down to one relationship. So where does this leave you? If you recognize yourself somewhere in this, either as the woman trying to understand a man who keeps pulling away, or as someone trying to become the kind of woman who no longer bends herself out of shape, waiting for someone else's fear to resolve, the path forward is not about becoming cold. It is not about weaponizing indifference. It is about genuinely, patiently, deliberately building a life so full and so anchored that your emotional well-being stops, depending on someone else's ability to show up consistently. That process takes time. It is not a weekend project. It involves real grief sometimes, real disappointment, real moments of wanting to go back to old patterns simply because they feel familiar, even when familiar is not the same thing as good for you. But on the other side of that work is something genuinely freeing. You stop asking whether you are enough to make someone stay. You start asking instead whether someone is actually capable of matching the life you have already built for yourself. That is not arrogance. That is self-respect applied consistently, even when it is inconvenient, even when it is lonely, even when part of you still wishes the old pattern would somehow work out differently this time. If this helped you understand something about a man, or maybe more importantly, something about yourself, stay with me because we are going deeper into exactly these patterns every single week. Real psychology, no fluff, no shame, just clarity about why the people you love behave the way they behave. And more importantly, how you build a life strong enough that their behavior stops determining your peace. Before you go, tell me honestly, have you ever watched someone panic the moment you stopped chasing them? Have you ever felt someone's entire energy shift the second you got quiet, calm, and unbothered instead of anxious? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one. And whatever you are going through right now, someone else in that comment section has been exactly where you are and made it to the other side. You were never too much. You were simply too full of life for someone who was still afraid of living fully himself. And the moment you stop shrinking to make that comfortable for him, everything changes, not because you tried to change it, but because you finally stop negotiating your own worth in exchange for someone else's comfort.